admit, deeply entertaining remarks. Wonderful way to kick off this conference. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing my friend and mentor, Hudson Institute Distinguished Fellow Krista Muth, who is going to be moderating a panel of noted experts momentarily. Chris set the gold standard for think tank management as president of the American Enterprise Institute for a quarter century. No think tank before or since has had as pronounced an impact on the American policy debate, foreign and domestic, as AEI did under Chris's leadership. But Chris's long sojourn into the hard work of think tank management, and it is hard work, I say to the member of the board of the Heritage Foundation, as you well know, led Chris unwillingly to leave behind his first love, which is the study of regulatory policy. Before heading AEI, Chris ran the deregulation task force at the Kennedy School of Government, and that pedigree notwithstanding, was named to be executive director of the regulatory task force, the deregulation task force for the Reagan White House, and eventually became director of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB. Since joining Hudson 6 years ago, Chris has written widely on the need to end executive feedback and rollback, reverse the unaccountable administrative state by regulatory rollback and a return to accountable and constitutional governance. His work has deep resonance in the Trump administration and on Capitol Hill, and it's for those reasons and others that I'm delighted to welcome Chris to the podium.
Ken, thank you very much. The first of two panels is on the origin of the Kigali Amendment and the current status of ratification. We have four highly distinguished and accomplished panelists. They're going to speak, give presentations. We'll mix it up a little bit here on the panel, and then we will turn to audience questions and answers. We'll go on for an hour. When we're concluded, there'll be a 5-10 minute break, and then our second panel on economic and business perspectives on the amendment will begin. Let me say a few words about each of our panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. Jim Hammitt is professor of economics and decision sciences at the Harvard School of Public Health and director of the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis. His research applies quantitative methods to the management of environmental issues with important scientific uncertainties, such as global climate change and stratospheric ozone depletion. He is the author of more than 100 academic papers on these and related subjects, and has served on numerous government advisory committees and National Academies of Sciences panels. Dave Banks is Special Assistant to President Trump for Energy and the Environment at the White House National Economic Council and National Security Council. During the George W. Bush administration, he served in senior positions at the State Department and at the White House Council on Environmental Quality on international environmental, energy, and climate change issues. In the years before joining the Trump administration, he was senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and executive vice president of the American Council for Capital Formation. Jeff Holmstead is the senior attorney at the Bracewell law firm for energy, environmental, and climate change matters. In the George H.W. administration, he was intimately involved in the drafting of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. In the W. Bush administration, he was head of EPA's Office of Air and Radiation in 2001 through 5, where he fathered several important innovations in EPA's complex air pollution control programs. In my humble opinion, Jeff knows more about the Clean Air Act than any other living person. Mark Diorio is Director General of the Industrial Sector's Chemicals and Waste Directorate at Environment and Climate Change Canada. A research scientist, he has been an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa and at the Université de Montreal. Within the Canadian government, he has held a number of senior positions in environmental policy, energy policy and geology, and has been head of delegation and chief negotiator for the Montreal Protocol and other major international agreements. We begin with Professor Hammitt.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. I might comment. One of the first things I did professionally, I was working at the Rand Corporation, and we were working for the Environmental Protection Agency, trying to estimate the costs and consequences of phasing out chlorofluorocarbons. These are some of the scientific workshops leading up to the Montreal Protocol. So I've been with this issue for a long time now. A little bit of background. Fundamental point from a policy perspective is both CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, and HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, have very long atmospheric lifetimes. So once they're in the atmosphere, they persist for decades or centuries, which means they're completely well mixed in the atmosphere, which means it doesn't matter where they're released from on the Earth, which country. It also means it doesn't matter very much when they're released. 5 years, 10 years earlier or later won't have a big effect since they'll be up there for a century anyway. Another point is both CFCs and HFCs and related compounds are classes of compounds that tend to have the same effect. They differ in their potency, either their ozone depletion efficiency or their global warming potential. But that means it makes sense to think about managing these as classes of compounds. So you put a cap on all CFCs or some class of CFCs, and then industry can innovate and figure out which are the ones that are least costly to reduce the emissions of, and reduce those emissions a lot, and maintain the productive uses of the other compounds where it's more difficult to substitute away. So going back to the Montreal Protocol, the sort of scientific history here is the key paper was published in 1974 by Mario Molina and Sherry Rowland, who identified that chlorofluorocarbons, because they're so chemically stable, would remain as they are until they reach the stratosphere, where they'd be broken down by intense ultraviolet radiation. And a consequence of that would be they would then catalyze the destruction of stratospheric ozone, increasing ultraviolet light penetration to the surface of the Earth, causing more skin cancers, cataracts, a variety of ecosystem effects, potentially severe effects on the phytoplankton of the oceans, which are the food base for the marine ecosystems and so forth. So once this news got out, there was a pretty quick consumer reaction. In the United States at the time, about half of the chlorofluorocarbon use was used as propellants of aerosols, like hairspray and other personal care products. And that seemed kind of frivolous compared with this big environmental catastrophe. So there's a big consumer reaction to shift away from aerosols, CFCs. It was easy to do. We could substitute pump sprays or other propellants. And that was effectively ratified later by the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies imposing a ban on aerosol use. Canada, Norway, Sweden, and perhaps a few other countries also restricted aerosol use at the time. So we sort of thought we'd done a lot of good at that point, and then with economic recession, chlorofluorocarbon use was stable or declining for a while. But then in the 80s, the economy started growing again, CFC use started growing again, and the science raised new concerns about how potent these chemicals were. So that led to ultimately the negotiation of the Montreal Protocol. Among other things, there was a strong growth in mobile air conditioning in cars. Back in the 60s, very few cars had air conditioning. By 1970, fewer than half of the new cars in the US had air conditioning. By 1980, it was up to 70%, and now it's probably essentially all new cars. One thing that was important is chlorofluorocarbons were produced by only a handful of firms, about 20 in total at the time. So we don't know so much about what was going on in the Soviet Union and the former Soviet states. But setting that aside, there was one plant in India, but all the others were in the OECD countries, US, Europe, and a few others, Japan. Another thing that was important was the firms that produce chlorofluorocarbons like DuPont, Dow, Allied, and the like. CFCs were not their major profit center. They produced lots of other things. They were maybe 2% of profits to DuPont, and it wasn't worth kind of bearing serious reputational consequences to fight against CFC regulation if it wasn't really that important. Also, they foresaw that by shifting the playing field, by regulating CFCs, that would give an opportunity for the sophisticated firms like DuPont to develop substitutes, to develop other ways to serve their consumer needs. So it might actually be more profitable for them to stop producing these low markup bulk chemicals and shift to more competition and innovation. So the Montreal Protocol, as Steve Forbes said, was passed and negotiated in 1987. And what it did was capped production and consumption of chlorofluorocarbons and some related compounds. Now, notably, it didn't regulate emissions directly. So we only care about these chemicals once they're released to the atmosphere. So if they stay in a refrigeration system and never leak out, there would be no problem. But it'd be much more difficult to regulate emissions than to regulate production. And consumption was just production plus imports minus exports. So it's also easy to monitor. This was implemented in the US through a cap and trade system where the producers and importers had permits to produce fixed quantities of CFCs that were tradable among the different compounds and tradable within firms. So as Steve Forbes said, this is a way that allows industry and entrepreneurs to compete on technological development, finding better substitutes and the like. And this cap and trade system was the first major implementation of that idea in the US, paved the way for the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments that set up the sulfur dioxide trading program associated with electric utilities and the like. At the time, US produced about 30% of the CFCs. Other OECD countries produced about 56%, and the former Soviet Union and China produced the remaining 14%. So this is really a kind of first world problem at the time. In the Montreal Protocol, while there's lots of trading within the US and within the European Union, there was not trading between the blocs, which could have been useful, but probably not so important given the similarity in costs of compliance between the two places. So this is an open framework that allows competition to identify new substitutes, drive down the price of these new substitutes, alternative technologies, and is a huge success. And because of the simplicity of the rule setting these caps, it was easy to amend it over time, which happened. There were 4 subsequent amendments in pretty short order, reducing the allowable caps and expanding the set of compounds that were regulated. So it's really quite incredible that by 1996, worldwide production of chlorofluorocarbons was basically 0. So that's only 22 years after the 74 paper identifying the problem in the first place. So it's really quite an incredible success. Now the Kigali Amendment is somewhat similar, but I think there are a few differences that are relevant and challenging. As for CFCs, there are a modest number of producers. From some reports I saw, there are apparently 6 producers in the European Union. So while there are many, many users of these chemicals, there are not so many producers, so it's easy to get a handle on production. Unlike the days of Montreal Protocol, now the world is much flatter. The formerly developing countries have developed a lot. They're much richer than they used to be. And it looks as if at present, the developing countries produce and consume more HFCs than the industrialized countries by a ratio of about 60 to 40%. And of course, we expect rapid growth in those countries, less rapid growth in the industrialized countries. This suggests there could be greater benefits to allowing trade, at least in the form of tradable permits or something, between the different regions of the world. So I discovered a paper written this year by people at the Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is one of these very productive think tanks that's been mentioned. And that suggests that by 2040, 2050, the marginal cost of compliance with Kigali in OECD countries will be something of on the order of 100 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent, or maybe a little bit higher, whereas the cost in the developing countries will be more like 50 euros per ton of CO2 equivalent. So it might make sense for essentially the rich countries to buy emission permits or to have tradable emission permits between the developing and the developed countries. And one final point to make here is that if what we care about is the global warming impact of these chemicals, there's the global warming effect from the release of the chemicals, but there's also the energy efficiency effect of the chemicals while they're in use. So for something like the fluid in an air conditioning system or a refrigerator, if you had a high global warming potential HFC that was much more energy efficient than a low global warming potential alternative, it might be better on net to have the high HFC efficient fluid rather than the alternative. Let me point out, though, that a number of the alternatives that have been suggested are actually more energy efficient than the HFC. So here we would get two benefits by substituting from the HFC to some alternative. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Dave Banks.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to sound like a political hack after you. It's good to be here. Lots of familiar, friendly faces. It's a small world, this Montreal Protocol. I've got some clear remarks. My domestic policy colleagues took a look at these. This is important to note. I want to make sure that everyone understands that, so I'm half the coin in the energy environment space in the executive office. I do international, and then my domestic policy colleagues are certainly very much engaged in this issue. But let me thank the Hudson Institute for hosting this event. It's a really important issue. It's something that we're going to have to figure out. And I'm honored to be part of this panel with such distinguished guests, even this guy, Jeff Holmstead here. But as noted, I'm the President, Special Assistant for International Energy and Environment. In this job, my work is guided by perhaps the President's #1 priority, protect and enhance U.S. competitiveness, particularly in the manufacturing sector. The President wants to make sure that any international energy, any international environment agreement does not harm U.S. workers. That's why he rejected the Obama administration's Paris Pledge, which would have required onerous regulations across the American economy and would have certainly hit our manufacturing sector really hard. However, as he said multiple times, including in the Norwegian state visit, he's open to re-engaging in the Paris Agreement if it's a fair deal that can be worked out. Again, a deal that does not harm U.S. workers and manufacturing. And this is through the lens that our team is viewing Kigali. Our domestic policy colleagues are looking at other facts, and I'll get into that later. Let me cover briefly, I know that we talked a little bit about the history of the Montreal Protocol, really great points made. But I'd like to focus specifically on some of the U.S. participation angles in the Montreal Protocol, because I think it's important. It gives us some context here, and then I'll share with you some thoughts on where the administration stands. Look, everyone here understands that the Montreal Protocol is a remarkable success story of international cooperation. That path has had its challenges, especially when we've had enormous commercial interest at stake. Keep in mind, and maybe someone brought it up, but U.S. industry and industry in other parts of the world were at first strongly opposed to taking international action to end the production and consumption of CFCs. But then in the mid-'80s, U.S. industry achieved some remarkable breakthroughs in innovation. That, not surprisingly, brought about a shift in the U.S. negotiating position. Now, this is one of the key issues or key lessons that I draw from the protocol and from our experience. It's not enough to identify the environmental problem. Innovation creates the facts on the ground that allow us to make political progress. And then we need the confidence that this new path will appropriately balance economic growth and environmental concerns. This, in my opinion, is what is largely missing from the climate discussion. But believe it or not, the biggest hurdle to the Montreal Protocol was in Europe, not to call out my European colleagues who are here, but whose industry questioned the science. European opposition flowed largely from the fact that their companies were not as competitive as U.S. companies. They knew that U.S. companies were leading the way in innovation, and they opposed enhancing the U.S. competitive advantage. Now, today, environmental and climate policy largely drives economic policy in Europe, or at least that's my perspective, I suppose. So it's no surprise that they support Kigali. But needless to say, the Trump administration has a different perspective on the climate agenda. Our companies, however, and again, it's important to note, still lead the way in innovation, especially when it comes to Montreal Protocol-related issues. Now, this, again, is what our foreign policy team is focused on. How much would Kigali ratification enhance U.S. competitiveness? What happens to our domestic manufacturing subsector if we don't ratify Kigali? Again, one of my responsibilities is to help ensure that U.S. companies are allowed to continue to lead in innovation and do not face discriminatory practices in international fora that unfairly disadvantage them. And that's, again, one of the most important issues as we think through the Kigali Amendment. Now, if the president does decide to support Kigali, question there, but if he does, it will be largely because he wants to protect and create U.S. jobs and advance commercial interests, U.S. commercial interests. So needless to say, before we provide a recommendation to the president, we will need to have a really, really good economic information. We're going to have to have a real command of it. We understand that there's broad industry support, but we really want to understand in a more concrete way a few things: how this benefits U.S. companies, how it preserves and creates U.S. jobs, and how it can help the trade balance and foster exports to other countries. And we want to emphasize that, and I think Mr. Forbes brought this up, but Kigali must go to the Senate for advice and consent if it is to move forward. This is consistent with the protocol and all 4 prior amendments. This administration is not going to circumvent the Congress. But first, again, we need to know the economic impacts. I don't want to sound too repetitive, but I can't stress how important that is. Now, let me say a little bit about the domestic policy folks and where they are. A key question for them is how the United States would implement the amendment. We don't join agreements that we cannot implement. Maybe that's done in other parts of the world, but not here in America. And I understand, Jeff, you're going to talk a little bit about that, right? But as I think many of you know, part of EPA's rules on HFCs were vacated and remanded to the agency by the courts. And just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. Court of Appeals declined to rehear the case. So our domestic colleagues are working to determine if available authorities exist. And I think some would say the court has rejected at least some of them, or it appears to have rejected, or if there's a need for additional legislative authority to implement Kigali. These are important questions. They're valid concerns. And we, the foreign and domestic policy teams, are working closely together to figure out an approach to the amendment that is consistent with the president's priorities. Again, while the administration recognizes that Kigali enjoys broad industry support, we need to carefully think this through and do our best to ensure we understand the economic, the legal, the political, the environmental aspects of the amendment. We're continuing to work on this. I expect NSC and NEC, National Security Council, National Economic Council, will be working closely with the interagency. We'll be working closely with state, EPA, Commerce, and other colleagues in the coming months to consider whether to move forward, and if so, how would we go about it? We, the foreign and domestic policy teams, obviously welcome all stakeholders to engage us during these deliberations. My thanks again for the invite. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I have the unenviable task of talking about some more obscure issues that may not be quite as interesting to policymakers, but I'm going to do my best to explain them in a way that I think should bring some reassurance to Dave and his colleagues at the White House. As he mentioned, any time the United States is negotiating or going to enter into an international environmental treaty, one of the big questions is whether the United States has authority under existing law to implement that, or whether there will need to be additional legislation adopted by the Congress. There's some people who are maybe not down in the details assume that once the United States enters into a treaty, it's ratified by the Senate, that becomes the law of the land. But that, even though it's the law of the land as a constitutional matter, until there's an implementation mechanism, there's no self-implementation in these international agreements. So there needs to be there needs to be domestic authority, and if not, oftentimes Congress will pass legislation that goes along with the ratification. The Montreal Protocol is, I think, unique in this regard. Right now, the United States probably doesn't have authority to implement Kigali because it hasn't been ratified. But once it is ratified, there's a provision in the Clean Air Act that makes it very clear that, that the United States Environmental Protection Agency, under Title VI of the Clean Air Act, has authority to implement that amendment. You might think that this is a little strange, that, and for those of us who've thought a lot about the constitutional separation of powers, and I know Chris has, it's a little odd that an international agreement can provide legal authority to EPA. But Congress determined in 1990 that that's the very mechanism they wanted to have. Now, I'm sure you've all been looking forward to having a lawyer read some statutory provisions to you. I'm not going to go on at great length, but I want to just read three snippets that I think are enormously important here. So as again, several of the panelists have mentioned, when Congress adopted the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, it specifically adopted Title VI to implement the Montreal Protocol. So Title VI was all about the Montreal Protocol. In that title, they defined the Montreal Protocol not just as what existed at that time, but also, and this is from the definition of Montreal Protocol, adjustments adopted by the parties thereto and amendments that have entered into force. So the definition of Montreal Protocol specifically incorporates future amendments. Now, some people would say that's kind of a thin reed on which to hang your legal theory, but actually it's more specific than that, because that's in the definitional section. And then in another section, and again, I'm sure you're all going to want to write this down, Section 614B of the Clean Air Act specifically says that in the case of a conflict between any provision of Title VI and any provision of the Montreal Protocol, the more stringent provision shall govern. And then there's legislative history, and this is real legislative history. You know, Justice Scalia often complains about people cherry-picking statements in the congressional record from one or two people. There's actually official legislative history for the 1990 amendments. You may remember that that was discussed and negotiated for about a year and a half, and the final conference report says this about Section 614B. It says, if, and so this is explaining the language that I just mentioned. In the case of a conflict between any provision of Title VI and any provision of the Montreal Protocol, the more stringent provision shall govern. So this is what the conference report says. If the protocol is modified in the future to include new provisions that are more stringent than this legislation, such more stringent provisions will be controlling. there was, I think, an important court case, and I think one of our future panelists was involved in that court case. It was an NRDC versus EPA decision back in 2006, I believe. And I'm not going to go through the facts of that case, which are important, but it would take me a long time to do. But in essence, there had been an informal agreement among the parties to take certain actions. And it was a decision of all the Montreal Protocol parties, including the United States. The DC Circuit said that that was not US law, in essence, because it hadn't been ratified formally by the United States. But in making that decision, and one of the things that they said was, look, without sort of a formal process, either for Congress to act or for the US Senate to ratify something that had been submitted by the president, it would raise serious constitutional concerns if an international body could create law in the United States. But it went on to say specifically that where the president has submitted submitted a treaty for ratification to the Senate, and that has been ratified, then that overcomes those constitutional provisions. So very specifically, the 2006 NRDC case makes it pretty clear that once this amendment is ratified, EPA will have this authority to implement the provisions of the amendment. So some people say to me, well, why is that important? I mean, you still have to go through the Senate, right? I mean, you still have to, in fact, you have to get a 2/3 vote of the Senate. The Senate's always harder to get legislation passed. Why is it important that you don't need implementing legislation? And that is, when you submit something for ratification, it's an up or down vote. As much as I would like to amend the Clean Air Act, because I think there's some real problems that should be addressed by legislation, doing that is a Herculean task because of all of the other people who have their own ideas about the way the Clean Air Act should be amended. And the Act really hasn't been amended in any meaningful way for many, many years. So that's why, as a political matter, it's important that what you need is an up or down vote, and I believe if the administration submits the amendment for ratification, it will easily be ratified by the United States Senate. Thank you.
Mark, please.
Thank you. So the advantage of being the fourth speaker is you don't have to repeat everything else that's been said before, which is great. And so I'm here to provide the voice from the Great White North. So first, the Montreal Protocol. I mean, it is a great success. It is the most successful environmental treaty, perhaps the most successful UN treaty of any kind. And you have to wonder why that is. So to me, there are three fundamental reasons. The first one is it has universal ratification, so everybody's in. The second one is that, in fact, there's a mechanism to help developing countries meet the targets. And that's important because then there's a way of achieving what we need to achieve. And the World Health Organization has estimated, as was said before, that by 2010, we're avoiding 1 million new cases of skin cancer every year and about an equivalent number of cataracts. So really, as far as an outcome, is great. And the third, and perhaps the most important reason, is that industry was involved. And there was a need for innovation, and it did result in innovation and economic growth in that particular area. So those are three main factors that made the Montreal Protocol successful. A few months ago in Montreal, we did celebrate the 30th anniversary of the protocol with the meeting of parties. And we had our former Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, who was a conservative, who made a speech on the Montreal Protocol. He said, he worked with Reagan, he worked with Thatcher, and they were all involved in the ratification. So environment is not a partisan issue. It is an issue for mankind. So he made that point, and it was interesting to see him side by side with a Liberal minister talking about the environment and about the Montreal Protocol. So now, moving to Kigali. Kigali does a few things. First, we're dealing with some of the unintended consequences of these substitutions as we go through reducing and eliminating ozone-depleting substances. And by doing so, then we use HFCs, which has some other consequences. While it's not it's been shown that it's not a major ozone-depleting substance in and of itself. Some people argue it is not at all. It does have global warming potential. So dealing with that, it made sense to do it through the Montreal Protocol. And it was done as well with the leadership of the US, Canada, Mexico, and a number of other nations in order to drive this. The Kigali Amendment has been now ratified. Over 20 countries have deposited their instrument of ratifications. So it will come into force the 1st of January 2019. In Canada, we ratified it last year. And for us to ratify the agreement or the amendment, we needed to first get our own house in order, that is, change our regulations. So we changed the ozone depleting and hydrofluorocarbon regulations, which controls import, export, and production. So we made those changes, and so the way we start is by the end of 2019, we need to reduce by 10% the amount of HFCs we're using, or the whole calculation, the whole balance. And then it's a reduction, so it's a phase down, not a phase out, so a phase down of 85% by 2035. Our regulations are built in a certain way that they're not prescriptive in the substitution, but they have targets, so it has a limit per category of product on the global warming potential, and it can be ozone depleting. And that's the way the regulations are built. So those were the few comments I wanted to make about the way we've gone about things in Canada. We're strong proponents of the amendment and of its ratification, and our own house is in order with respect to regulations that we're going to bring forward. So thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm going to begin by asking members of the panel if they have any questions for others, if they want to amend their remarks in consequence of what they heard other people say.
Amend my remarks.
Jeff?
No, I can just say that I'm glad that we're not the only ones who have always challenged in looking at regulation and who has the authority to amend treaties. And it is a question that came up with respect to the federal cabinet and who has the right to do what within that framework. But our treaty amendments do go through the federal cabinet.
Yes.
Well, I was kind of hoping that Dave would say, after my brief talk, the United States government was convinced that they have authority to implement Montreal.
Yes, no.
So I know my lane, right?
You know your lane.
I do foreign policy.
I have one question. The Montreal Protocol has a mechanism in it. I think it operates through the United Nations. I'm a little fuzzy on this, where essentially developing countries are making contributions that are transferred to, developed countries to developing countries. There's some transfer mechanisms. How important is that for Kigali? And wouldn't a trading mechanism that was international, such as Jim described, wouldn't that substitute for that in some sense?
I'll comment. There's a lot of technical assistance and financial assistance through the Montreal Protocol, and some of it flows through GEM, which is, I forget, something
Global Environmental
Multilateral Fund and the JEF.
Right, thank you, which comes out of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But so in addition to kind of the country-level caps that were implemented within the U.S. through this tradable permit system, there are a lot of product-specific regulations, guidance on best practices, training, there's a technical assessment support panel, and a lot of explicit aid by the U.S. government and other parties, both to U.S. industry and to developing countries. But in principle, as you suggest, if we had a global tradable permit system, and if in fact it's true that production consumption could be reduced at lower cost in developing countries than industrialized countries, then the industrialized countries could buy permits from the developing countries, and that would create this financial flow you're suggesting.
Mm-hmm. We're going to turn to questions and comments from the audience. I will call on you. Please wait until the microphone has come your way, and it would be nice if you would introduce yourself before asking your question, which is a statement that ends with a question mark. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Pat Michaels with the Cato Institute. I've been around these issues for some time. I think I'm too old to carbon date.
And you're speaking on the second panel.
Yes, I am.
Yes.
But it won't be about this question.
Yeah.
I'm so ancient that I have a problem with something called the rule of law. And the instrument we're talking about is the Montreal Protocol on ozone-depleting substances. HFCs are not an ozone-depleting substance. They are a radiatively active trace gas, but it is not the protocol on ozone-depleting substances and radiatively active trace gases. By the logic that I'm hearing here, and I hope I'm hearing it wrong, I don't understand why there could not be an amendment to the Montreal Protocol on, say, PM 2.5, particulate matter, very small particulate matter, because that's a radiatively active substance also. I'm kind of wondering if there isn't a little bit of fear that someone is withstanding, and I don't know who that would be, is going to enter into a proceeding and saying, whoa, this is about ozone-depleting substances and these aren't. And I'm sure that all the very, very bright people, much smarter than I am in this room, have figured this out. So if you guys can answer this for me, I'd like to know. That's a question, not a statement.
Yes, very good. Thank you very much. I think I'll ask Jim and Jeff both to pronounce on this.
Yeah, so my initial reaction was like yours. I was surprised by this. But if you look at the Montreal Protocol, the initial text, which I won't quote exactly, says basically being mindful of concerns about stratospheric ozone and being mindful of other consequences to the stratosphere, we, the parties, convene to do this. But I think Jeff probably knows it better than I.
So here's my answer, and I think we could come up with outrageous hypotheticals, but the idea you're going to get not only the 100 and whatever it is, 90-some parties to the Montreal Protocol, and the United States President, and 66 votes in the Senate to do something crazy, it just seems, so as a practical matter, I'm not sure your concern is a legitimate concern. Now, you've been around longer than me. We've both seen how the regulatory state has sort of advanced over the years. But as a practical matter, I just don't see how that would ever happen. And I think that's one of the reasons why the court in the NRDC case made it clear that just an agreement among the parties that had not been submitted by the President, ratified by the U.S. Senate, would not trigger this authority under the Act. The other thing I would say is I initially had a similar concern. Look, at Title VI, we all know, is about ozone-depleting substances. But that's not what the statutory language says. And so if you believe in the rule of law, it's pretty hard to argue. You may think that was a bad decision by Congress and the President, and we all think that there's been some of those. But in terms of rule of law and constitutional issues, I don't think I just don't think they exist here, because that was a very explicit decision that was made by the Congress and the President who signed the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And that authority is pretty clear in the 90 amendments. And it's not limited to ozone-depleting substances.
One quick remark, and maybe I should have said that the HFCs are a consequence of regulations dealing with ozone-depleting substances. So it makes a lot of conceptual sense to say, if we're going to worry about ozone depletion, we ought to worry about all the consequences of the things we do to reduce ozone depletion. So it's not illogical that treating adverse side effects of the Montreal Protocol within the protocol would be a good way to do it.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to, this woman in the back, please. Yes.
Hi, my name is Elvina. I'm with Congressional Quarterly. I'm a reporter. Thanks for taking my question. Mine is directed at Mr. Banks. Would you be able to give us some kind of timing on when you expect to advise the president on, when you expect to give the president any recommendations on the Kigali Amendment, and when you expect the White House would send it to the Senate for ratification? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good question. Look, I think that we have a lot more work to do. I mean, we need to figure out. I talked about this a number of times in the, up there, but we need a better understanding of the economic analysis, right? What's the impact on our manufacturing subsector if we ratify versus if we don't ratify? So we're going to have to the president. And by the way, just back to the Patrick's earlier question. So I mean, I've certainly there are certainly those concerns, right, that are expressed, regulatory overreach, et cetera. The president is not ideological on these issues. The president, and I've told folks, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, all those top 5 priorities: trade, manufacturing, trade, manufacturing, trade, manufacturing, right? I think all of us know that. But we have to have a better understanding of the economics of this issue before we can move forward with any type of recommendation. No. No timeline.
That's a clear answer.
Gentleman up front, yes.
Thank you. I'm Mark Minzer from Danfoss. We're a manufacturer. Mr. Holmstead, question for you. I think if we were to poll the Senate now on Kigali, the major answer would be, huh? So why are you so confident that an up or down vote would pass?
So a couple of reasons. The president has a lot of influence with 51 senators at least. And if the president stood up and said, this is good for U.S. manufacturing, this is good for U.S. trade, I think for the very reasons that Dave is talking about, I think you'd have the Republicans. The other thing is, all of us have been in Washington long enough to know that the business community has a fair amount of clout. And based on what I've seen, the vast majority of the U.S. business community supports this. And oh, by the way, you happen to have environmental groups who support it as well. And so I think, given this unusual confluence of events, I think it really is essentially up to the administration to decide, because if they believe that if they submit it for ratification, I'm very confident that it would get ratified. Although I agree with you, if you polled senators right now and said, do you support ratification of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, you'd get a lot of blank stares.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have a question, but I want to give it a little background first. Who are you? I'm Dave Stevenson with the Cesar Rodney Institute. Again, sorry. This one is particularly for you, Mr. Banks. We heard that the D.C. District Court has thrown out the appeal. I think a comment that they made in throwing out the appeal may be useful. The industry interveners are rent seekers trying to use the government to foreclose their competitors' products. The word crony comes to mind. HFOs are now $70 a pound versus $4 a pound for HFCs. That raises the price of a car $100. Raises the price of fixing your air conditioner in your car $100. So the question is, do you see President Trump in front of his base making a speech saying, I approved this on the thin thread of Title VI that's never been tested, and we're going to raise your price of your car?
I don't see him saying it that way. But to your point, you do raise a really important issue, and I should have probably included that in my list of things that we have to understand on the economic side. We have to have a really good or a firm grasp on regarding the impacts on consumers, right? No question about that.
I can help you with that. I've done the analysis.
Good.
Thank you.
I'm looking around if there are any more questions. If not, I'm going to offer an opportunity to the people on the panel if you want to make any concluding remarks as I bring down the gavel. I want to thank each of you for really superb, highly informed, well-organized, crisp presentations that I learned a lot from, and I think everybody in the room did. We are going to adjourn now. We're going to have a break of 10 minutes, and that's not 11 minutes. It may even be 9 minutes. And our second panel will assemble. We're going to hand them our mics, and we will begin in that amount of time. Let me ask everybody to join me in thanking our panelists for superb presentations.